So I work at O'Reilly Media. I've been there about 15 years. I'd like to talk about telling the functional programming story from a slightly different perspective. You all are functional programmers. You breathe this air. This is your show. You know these things. I am an Erlang addict as well. I don't always breathe this air the same way, but I'm happy to be here. The problem with Erlang is that once you've used Erlang, it's really hard to take the claims of any other programming language seriously. It's not that they don't do what they say they'll do. It's that Erlang's basic architecture lets you do things easily that feel like painful, forced horribleness in other languages. And every time I go to do something in another language, I'll confess up front that I mostly work in JavaScript, I look at the way that the system I'm using is architected, and I say, if I only had my events, and if I only had my messages and my processes instead of my events, this could all go much more smoothly. The choices, the balancing acts that Erlang took on, the discipline that Erlang provides, there isn't anything that beats Erlang's core model of messaging among cleanly separated processes. Maybe someday we will find something that does it better. But for now, I'm happy to say that Erlang is the champion. And I am addicted to it. I'm a part-time Erlang tour guide. I wrote 2 books. Well, I wrote one and wrote half of the other one. I wrote Introducing Erlang because I ran into this wonderful language and thought that more people should be able to approach it. It's a complicated challenge explaining a language that is so simple in so many ways, yet doesn't meet expectations that programmers have absorbed from other environments. Personally, I was corrupted very early on by AppleSoft Basic and 6502 Assembler and various forms of tying yourself into knots. After that, I spent a few years in the orthodox, classical, however you want to call it, object-oriented world. I was really excited about Java. Finally, this was going to solve all the problems that I had. I now describe myself as a Java refugee. The less said about that, the better. At the same time, though, my work, the job that I was actually doing was rarely programming. I have, programmed for a living at times. I most recently wrote an iPhone application a few years ago. But most of the time what I do is I tell stories. I tell stories myself. I write. I'm also addicted to writing. Fortunately, I've stayed away from the cigarettes. There are too many things that are easily addictive. Worse than that, I not only write myself, but I encourage other people to write. I look for people who want to tell a story and try to find ways to help them tell that story. I specifically have been looking for stories that help people solve technical problems. It would be fun to edit something else, but I haven't gotten there yet. There's a lot more to this, as you'll see, than just finding people, letting them write, and putting their stuff on the presses. It would be fun to do that, but, well, it is fun to do that, but there's just a lot more going on at every step of this conversation, and that conversation affects this larger Erlang conversation. The way that we tell that story brings people in, pushes people away, helps people out, sometimes leaves them very confused. We can definitely keep going and do better with this. So this isn't really a quiz, this is just something to think about. But who said this? Generally, the craft of programming is the factoring of a set of requirements into a set of functions and data structures. I like that definition. It sums up a lot of the ways that I look at the world. It's simple, it's clean. So stepping back, this is the world that I live in. When I first started at O'Reilly in 2001, my job was to craft print books, which were going to be these beautiful objects that people could put on their desks to intimidate their managers. I mean, no. We put a lot of effort into every page of every O'Reilly book to make sure that it was the right subject, the right voice, the right telling, a lot of polishing all the way along to make these things that we would then sell. However, shortly after I arrived at O'Reilly, they started selling a lot less well. And as you can tell, the trend has continued. I should talk a little bit about this data. This is North American data from Nielsen BookScan. O'Reilly has its own contraption for sucking in book sales data and presenting it to the world. I'll talk a little bit more about its imperfections, but the main thing to know for here is that this is North American print data. And so it's not everything, it's not complete, it's just kind of the most useful indicator that we've found yet. So that's tech book sales. That includes everything from Microsoft Word, the missing manual, to everything you wanted to know about assembly language, to Erlang. Programming book sales. Unfortunately, you can see at the beginning of that there was a fairly steep drop. We sort of tell two stories about that. One is that the .com bust happened. The beginning of that chart is 2003, so this is actually a bit after the .com bust had set in, but that was still being felt throughout the world. The other is the internet happened. And it's not just that the internet appeared. You know, it's been around a long time. The web has been taking speed for a long time. It's that in the early part of the 2000s, ironically during this .com bust phase, that really hit critical mass, where your Google search to find my obscure error message suddenly worked. It made a lot less sense to go out and buy something just to find one glitch. I remember when I was doing a lot of work with Microsoft Access, this is painful to admit, I went out and I bought a book for $50 because it had 2 pages out of 800 pages that solved my problem. That was $50 that I would not have spent had Google existed at the time that I was using it. That programming section does not include JavaScript. I just want to include that so you can get a sense of what that looks like. It starts out badly, but then there's this JavaScript renaissance here. There's a giant spike on the end of that I think is worth noting. Wiley and John Duckett figured out how to make books that were beautiful, that people wanted to buy on web subjects. So that gigantic spike is the initial release of JavaScript and jQuery. And as we'll see, spikes tell us a lot of stories. So JavaScript book sales right now are about 1,500 units per week in print in North America. Functional programming book sales right now are about 200 units per week in print in North America. And the curve looks very, very different. You can see at the beginning there just weren't a lot of sales. I hate to say it, I don't think that first Erlang book actually shows up in this data. I don't know. I'll have to go do some more research. I tried to buy a copy of it at one point, but was amazed by how expensive that one had become. So if you have it, hold on to it. It's a good investment. There's a bright future there. So every time you see a spike on this chart, I went through and double-checked this. They correspond to specific books. That is the launch of a book that's taking off for usually its initial release. Sometimes books take a little while to hit the spike, but usually that jump is within a few weeks of the book becoming available. So the first of those spikes is Practical Common Lisp, which A-Press had a nice hit with. There had been an endless line of people telling O'Reilly that we should publish on Lisp, and why don't you have a Lisp book? And we hadn't gotten to it. A-Press got there first. This sold very nicely. As you'll see, it's in some of the bestseller lists. But Lisp programming hasn't become a giant sales space. The next one is the second Erlang book, Joe Armstrong's Programming Erlang, which rocketed up the charts in 2007. 2008, we see Programming in Scala make its debut, and this one just continues to sell. 2008, RealWorld Haskell, the title that had people inside O'Reilly very nervous. RealWorld Haskell? It turns out it was the right title, and people really like it. So sometimes it's good to take a risk on these things. Francesco joins the lists here, June 2009, with Erlang programming. You weren't? I guess we were still scared at the time. I don't know. I've never done real-world JavaScript either, so we'll see. Learn you a Haskell for great good, my favorite grammar in a book title ever. And then more recently, functional programming in Scala in September 2014, not to be confused with programming in Scala. There seem to be a limited number of book title choices in the world. Either you can do something goofy and fun, or you choose 3 words and that's all you have. Okay, so back to my quote. The person who said this granted IBM a license to use his code for evil. There are not a lot of people who've had that privilege. So I wanted to look at how this market has changed over the last 12 years. The data that I'm working with goes back to 2003. Obviously, functional programming goes back to the mists of time, at least in the computing world. But over time, we've seen things shift. And I should also note, you saw that initial curve. So the first few years of this, these bestsellers are bestsellers among their peers, but they aren't actually selling that fantastically well. So ANSI Common Lisp, which I believe is a textbook from Pearson, was doing well. The first couple of years, you see Haskell, you see Lisp, you see Scheme pop up a few times. There's an odd thing in our data where the Little Schemer is not considered a functional programming book, which is obviously crazy, but we'll fix that. I think that's in there someplace too. At least I got my copy in 2006. The next year, you start seeing Erlang pop up. And so programming Erlang, congratulations, Joe, had was the leading title in the functional programming space in 2007 and 2008. You start seeing other topics creep into the mix. You still have Lisp and Haskell, but you also start seeing F#. Scala appears in 2009. But programming Erlang and Erlang programming, stay really strong in this period. Clojure appears in 2010. There is another real world. There's a real world functional programming with F# and C#. I guess it's .NET, so it must be the real world. Things change more recently, though. So you see Scala really starting to dominate there. Largely, that's the one book programming in Scala that's done really consistently well. There's still Haskell, Lisp, Clojure. Learn you some Erlang for great good makes its debut in 2013, gives us another title with some excellent grammar. And then in 2014, we're back to Haskell and Scala. In 2015, so far, less than half the year in, we are at 5 out of 6 of the best-selling functional programming language books being on Scala. Some are new, some are old, but Scala is clearly the place to be in functional programming publishing. Now, there's another part of the functional programming publishing world that I should talk about that really hasn't been in that data so far. You saw a little bit of it at the beginning. But functional programming is not just something that people working in functional programming languages do. I had the privilege of editing a book which has made functional programming mainstream for a vast group of people. And it was written by the person who said that quote. If you ever get the chance to talk to Douglas Crockford about Erlang, it's a wonderful conversation. I highly encourage it. But he made his mark in functional programming in JavaScript. That wasn't what he sold the book as. JavaScript, the good parts, does not say functional programming in JavaScript. It was kind of a, well, we'll tell it this way and see what happens kind of story. The message of that book and what's percolated in the 8 years since it appeared is shifted the entire JavaScript universe. Well, not the entire universe, probably almost all of the leading edge of that universe, and probably half of the people beyond that. From what had been a traditional object manipulation language, which, by the way, you could create objects in if you felt like doing things in a weird way, to a functional programming language which just happens to manipulate a bunch of objects, most infamously the DOM, but the whole structure of the language has changed because of this one message. I won't say it's because of this one book. I think it probably would have happened even if Doug hadn't written this, but it definitely made a difference over time. And so if we look at JavaScript, the good parts, and its sales, it has that beautiful initial spike. It kind of drops. It kind of comes back. It's selling about 150 units a week right now. And remember that I said that the functional programming category as a whole, books on functional programming languages are selling about 200 units a week. So there's definitely a disconnect between functional programming and functional programming languages when we look at the publishing world. To put it a little more starkly, I just compared numbers inside OReilly. So this does not include Joe's book, but it does include my book and Francesco's. One book, JavaScript, the good parts, has sold approximately 10 times the total number of units of everything OReilly has ever done in Erlang. That, as you'll see, is not necessarily the right calculation because successful books are outliers, but it tells you a big story about how functional programming is reaching different groups of people. Before we get too depressed about the BookScan data, I should talk a little bit about its limitations, and there are many, many limitations. First of all, it's North American sources, mostly the US and Canada. It's print books, but it's not direct sales of print books. If you do me a big favor and order books directly from OReilly, those numbers don't show up in the BookScan data. The same if you order from the Prags or Manning or anything like that. The publishers know those sales happened, and we like them, but they don't tell the outside world that, hey, these books got sold. Ebook sales are the gigantic missing piece, and they're working on that piece, but if you want a really complicated conversation, talk about tracking ebook sales across vendors who don't trust each other or like each other or any of that. More specifically to the point, I looked at my own books. I feel pretty comfortable talking about numbers for things that I've done. And for introducing Erlang, 78% of sales of that book lifetime, that's in units, are electronic. So there's only 20% of that book's reach that's even visible in BookScan, and of that, a small portion actually turns up. For introducing Elixir, it's even more severe. It's 82%. Some of that has to do with introducing Elixir as a more recent book, and the early release is only electronic and things like that. But basically, you're seeing a very small sliver of what the world actually is when you look at BookScan. And the other important thing to remember is we talk about tech publishing, and we historically came from books, but there's much more going on. From OReilly's definition of publishing, what we're doing here is a publishing event because we have speakers who are sharing knowledge and talking and telling these stories. We don't usually say that we're publishing a conference. We say that we're putting on a conference, but the rest of the conversation is pretty much that it's a publishing story. When I looked at introducing Elixir, which is a more severe case because it's more recent and it's in an age when Barnes & Noble is not likely to carry such books, for instance, out of even the print sales, only 1/6 of the print sales for this book that OReilly registers are registered in BookScan. And also combining that with the crazy 82% electronic, and you end up with, 1/34 of all sales show up in BookScan. So you don't need to get too nervous about the BookScan data. At the same time, is there a booming Elixir universe? I just got this great package last week from Manning. I got Elixir in action. Are things just taking off? Are they growing? Maybe. But as you look at the BookScan data and you compare it to other sources, when a book is hot, when a book is really, really selling, it's going out through all of those print sources the BookScan registers. So the more popular a book is, odds are good the BookScan data is more accurate for it. It is possible that there is a wonderful underground economy in Erlang books, and that Dave Thomas and Manning and a bunch of other folks are getting spectacularly wealthy. I want them to tell me about it. But I think we're all pretty much in the same boat. Where these things are doing well, we're happy with them, but they aren't spiking, they aren't surging, they aren't taking off. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what this means for what I do and how that affects you. So I come from the land of publishing. My first job out of college was at Kinko's Copies, which I describe as my time in manufacturing. I try to be involved in every aspect of publishing possible. Working at Kinko's was completely easy compared to what the early printers had to do. I didn't have to set type. I didn't have to think about getting the ink right. There were these Xerox guys who'd come and fix the toner if things broke. The speed and efficiency of that belt and flashing light compared to the manual press. 3,600 pages a day was awesome. In 1,500, 1,600, that was great. I can do like 3,600 copies on my laser printer at home in under an hour now, I'm pretty sure. The setup was complicated. The production process was pretty astounding. Like we think about the printing press as the innovation. When you think about what had to go into crafting the type, when you think about what had to go into just creating a process that could keep track of all of those pages of paper without misplacing them, losing them, folding them. A printer space was not just the box with the printing press. It was the warehouse in which all of that stuff got stored as they were making the books and then binding them. And then, once you've made this wonderful object, you have to get it in the world. And yes, there were printers, and this was totally common for a while, who sold directly from their offices. But over time, this distribution network appeared. Bookstores appeared. People who knew how to get you books sort of got it started, and then it grew. So at this point, the printing part has gotten much simpler, but all of that inventory and distribution is still exciting. That biases a lot of things in publishing to be certain ways. We are technologically determined by our means of production. That sounds terribly Marxist or something. But anyway, we have these tools. Using these tools shapes the way that we work. So the classic story of writing a book is somebody sits down and writes the book, and the editor looks through it and makes sure that everything is good, and then you're off to the presses, and it's great. Except that it's not really that way. It is a build process where the builders are involved constantly. You can automate some pieces of this, but human input is everywhere in the system. It is the main constraining factor on what we can do, even beyond the magic of printing technology. Documents. I spent a lot of time in XML. When I first came to OReilly, I was supposed to be the XML guy. I think we all know how well that lasted. But documents may be this tiny amount of information, relatively speaking. If you picture cyberspace as this giant architectural construction, documents are a few cottages off on the corner. They are still deeply intricate. They are really complicated to get right. If you think of them as kind of the miniatures of the data world where every detail has to be just right, that's the nature of the craft. There is, even once you've sorted out your document structure, OReilly has a bunch of document structures. We know document structure really probably too well. The structure isn't enough. You can have this beautiful, tightly built thing, but if it doesn't reach a human audience, it doesn't make any difference at all. And connecting to the audience is a blend of psychology, of writing, of knowing what the audience wants. There was a time in the early days when people wanted information about computers so badly that even bad information was better than no information. I have fun going back through some like 60s and 70s stuff, which were kind of the first reachings of computing stories to the world. But at this point, the audience is pretty demanding. They expect a lot of things that we've made them used to. We've told people that you will have explanations that will help you solve these problems. They will be in English or whatever language in a form that you can digest and possibly even enjoy. The best tech books actually are enjoyable. It's hard to describe that to some folks, but it does happen that way. The other amazing thing about this is that every project is different. I have a few authors. I love these authors. They send me stuff. They already know what our expectations are. They meet those expectations from the beginning, and I can just follow this write proof print cycle. It happens maybe 1 in 100 times, and even then there's always a twist because that's just the way it is. If they got it all right, we probably did something different. Our process changes every week or two. Not drastically, it's mostly an evolution, but when I think about how we created books with FrameMaker when I first got to OReilly, and I think about how we now print most of our books using HTML and CSS to generate PDFs, and I look at how we got there, we had some wonderful accidental moments where I did a book on Unicode, and we couldn't get some of the characters to print, so we had to come up with an alternative printing process, or PDF generating process. And that led to this, which led to this other thing. More recently, I have an author who has decided that he wants to write books like he does in software, and so he's creating it in GitHub, which makes great sense. But it's not just that he's writing it in GitHub. Kyle Simpson, who's writing You Don't Know JS, wants us to edit in GitHub. So I got to be the lucky person to tell his author, his editor, you know, you've spent 20 years editing in a corner in the dark, just talking with the author. Do you think you could do it in public this time? Will that make everybody happy? And so far it has. It works. But suddenly you're going from a quiet conversation to doing these things in front of the whole world. And all of that publishing culture has told us over the past centuries that you only release it when you know it's good. So coming out with something that's uncooked and then having a conversation about how it's uncooked is about as uncomfortable a process as you can get. Oh, so, okay, I'll get my discomfort out here. The other important piece of this is that I have a gambling addiction. Now, this doesn't mean that I go to the tables and play. I don't. If I go to a gambling venue, I have like a $20 limit, and if it lasts an hour, that's great. I just know I'm going to lose it. That's just the way the world is. But publishing books is a lot like playing roulette. You are looking at a topic. You are looking at an author. You are putting a bet down on the table and then spinning the wheel and seeing what happens. You can sign a contract with the world's greatest author, and lightning strikes, and they're not your author anymore. You can choose a topic that seems like a complete, guaranteed, wonderful hit at the start of the process, and by the time the book comes out, even if it comes out quickly, it's yesterday's news and nobody cares. The way that we deal with this is by creating a list of books rather than a single book. And in tech books, this is somewhat easier. My first job in publishing proper, not at Kinko's, was at a New York publishing house that had a computer book division. And the reason they had a computer book division was that computer books, for all their ups and downs, felt like a more stable thing than fiction and reference and all the other work that they did. When you publish a fiction book, it's almost always going to lose money. That's just the way it is. You're going to put this investment into creating this wonderful story that somebody will read, but not enough people will read because the cost of the investment is so gigantic that sales have to be big to make up for it. The way that fiction publishing works is that you expect the vast majority of your list to lose money or maybe barely break even. The stark number that I heard was 90% of your list is not going to make it. There'll be about 5% of your list, 5 to 7% of your list that does really, really well. It makes money. It's enough that you could, imagine doing this for a living. Things are good. But the way that the publishing house survives and keeps that other 90% in print is that the top 3 to 5%, and increasingly it's more like 1%, of books bring in vast, vast quantities of money. You made that investment. It's taking off. Stephen King is doing great. Harry Potter is selling like crazy. Why can't everything be like Stephen King and Harry Potter? There's a classic story about investors who bought their way into Hollywood, and they were going to fix Hollywood because they knew what the problems were. It was obvious when you looked at the balance sheet. You look at a studio, and 80% of their films are losing money. Just bloodbath. And 20% are making money. So the obvious answer is stop doing those 80%. They're not making you any money. And the only answer to this is fine. Which part is the 20%? We don't know until we get there. That's just the challenge of it. So it makes life complicated and exciting. And when you get a hit, it's that gambler's rush of, oh, I got to go do more of these. One other thing that buffers it a bit, when you play roulette and you put down a bet, when the wheel stops, you're done. There's no backlist in roulette. You can't say, I bet on 23 last time and it came up this time, pay me. In publishing, we have a backlist. And this is what provides stability. This is what allows there to be an industry, is that there are still people buying Harry Potter books. There are still people buying books that came out 30 years ago, 5 years ago. They're still valuable. They're still needed. In tech books, it's a little bit harder because things go out of date. Though I'm still looking for that first Erlang book. Publishers love stability in certain ways. So if you can reuse that investment that you put in up front, all that typesetting, all that editing. When I worked at this publishing house, they talked about sending plates from place to place because the plates were already set. And making revisions to those plates, I mean, you could do it, but why would you want to? Even though it was electronic, it was still this giant struggle because you were putting things on these massive machines that had their own requirements beyond give me a PDF. Now, I mentioned that fiction publishers have it hard because so much of their list loses money. The good news for the fiction publishers is that there are not a lot of revisions in fiction publishing. You go back and you fix typos. Every now and then, authors want to do some kind of crazy second edition, but it doesn't happen very often. Usually, it's once and done. You publish it in hardcover. If you're lucky, somebody will want to publish it in paperback, and they'll just buy your plates and give you money, and this is wonderful. Tech publishers have a different kind of stability. Now, it's great if you can publish a book and it lasts for 10 or 15 years. That does happen sometimes in tech books. Frequently, it happens with textbooks. At least they're more stable, they're more abstract, and they can keep going. I think the design patterns book is just perpetually in motion. Tech publishers like a different kind of stability, though, because it's great if people keep buying the book in smaller quantities over time. It's even better if every 2 years or so there's this predictable wave of people buying a new and updated edition. We can't manipulate this the way that textbook publishers do, where they have a new edition every year or two to keep the used book sales down. That's bad news. But the paradise used to be Microsoft Windows, because we would go from Windows 95 to Windows 98 to, I've forgotten my Windows versions. Anyway, you could take a book and you could update it. It was still mostly the same structure. It was still mostly the same content. You had to redo all the screenshots, fine. You had to add some new content, fine. But, half the people who bought your previous edition, if they liked it, would buy it again. And then you'd get a new audience of people who wanted the latest and greatest and had never seen your book before. So you just had this regular train of flowing purchases that made life really happy. Unfortunately, the Windows machine has kind of broken down. The Mac machine does sell books. Mac OS X, The Missing Manual, was one of OReilly's biggest bestsellers when it first came out. But we've gone to this kind of continuous cycle of software that doesn't have the same, I've got to install the new latest and greatest, unless maybe you're talking about people who watch WWDC keynotes compulsively. Even worse, on the open source side, my favorite side, you have projects like Rails or Node or all of the software around them where stuff is changing weekly. The version numbers are not always distinctive. I was working on learning Rails at one point. I think it was between 3.2.24 and 3.2.26, and all of my code broke in the entire book. It was a very bad day, but at least it happened before the book had gone to the printers. And that kind of pain makes it very hard to figure out how best to publish for these spaces. The usefulness of a book in the tech field is really directly linked to how tightly it tracks the current version of whatever is happening. Now, sometimes publishers can still publish useless. I love the title of this, Pataphysics, a useless guide. I would love to do things like that. It's MIT Press. I mean, it's got to be a tech book, right? But if there's a market, somebody will find it. Fortunately for MIT Press, this book will probably last much longer than most of the books I'm publishing. Now, I talked before about how it's not just print anymore. 82% of introducing Elixir is electronic. It gets a little more complicated than that, because I was using units for that calculation, and a lot of the world that's reading books these days is not actually reading ebooks delivered as PDFs or Kindle Mobi files or something else that comes in a specific unit. They're buying subscriptions. They're getting access to an entire library of stuff that publishers have created. In the case of the one up here, which is Safari, you're not just getting OReilly content, you're getting content from Pearson and from lots of other publishers. My apologies, that top graphic is about a closure demo, so we'll just pretend that didn't happen. But as we've reached this point where people are constantly searching, they constantly need the newest, the latest, and greatest, it becomes easier to have a library that you can search that's specifically for your computer problems rather than just going to Google, putting in random error messages, and hoping you can filter through the noise. So we're seeing a change in models at the same time that we're seeing the print model decay. So publishing and programming are cousins in some ways. I don't want you to leave here thinking that publishing is really weird, that those Gutenberg people got things really strange, and why would you do that? We have a lot of things that we do the same. Both publishing and programming have a lot of upfront work to get to the point where something is useful. There's a mix of standard pieces and custom pieces. Scale is wonderful when you have it. Well, in programming, scale can create some other issues too, but publishing depends on scale. Programming can thrive at scale. Testing. We haven't figured out how to automate our proofreading yet. We don't really have unit tests for paragraphs. We can dream about it. We do it differently. And the revision problem, as I mentioned, it's not just that numbering additions and numbering code is hard. Things change. Change is complicated. But publishing is really different from programming in some other ways. I would love to stand up here and tell you all about our Agile Publishing model. There are some Agile Publishing models. They're much easier to do when you're a smaller organization, especially when you're a single author doing your own stuff and have control over the whole process. But historically, this printing press model has made publishing about as waterfall a process as you can get. You want everything done right before it releases. You want a clear path to the release. It's changed over the last few years, but for a very long time, the sales team had to know about what was going to be delivered 6 months to a year in advance, which meant that you would get the manuscripts and you would have to sit on it for a long time because you had to build up your sales story to give this thing any kind of a chance in the bookstores. It's hard for me to imagine these days, but it definitely has been the story. Publishing can be lured into new spaces. I think the Prags demonstrated with Rails, and then again publishing Joe's Erlang book, that pioneering can be really fruitful. OReilly has pioneered a lot of things a lot of times, but it's difficult to be a pioneer when you have this very large structure that you're working to maintain. So we know who our audience usually is. We try to find new and exciting things that fit that audience. As much as I would love to publish Pataphysics, a useless guide, I think if that came out with an OReilly cover, people would just be confused. Every now and then, you can push into new frontiers and you can catalyze. I brought up JavaScript, the good parts, earlier, not just because of its sales figures, but because that book changed the conversation. Joe's book changed the conversation. These things can happen, and they do happen because of books. It just doesn't happen often enough or reliably enough that we can look at a proposal and say, this thing's going to change the conversation. We should do that. There's a lot of risk in that. We are moving towards more iterative models. You've probably seen early releases. Manning has Meeps. The Prags have their own. I mentioned the editing live on GitHub story. We are trying to find ways to show more of what's going on to people earlier instead of that classic sit on it for 6 months while sales sells it to bookstores model. But it's still nothing resembling an iterative programming process. A lot of people look at tech books and think, great, documentation. And sometimes they're right about this. Missing manuals are documentation. That's just the nature of them. We started publishing them because people stopped putting documentation in the box. But in publishing, the explanation is the product. It's not a side effect. We talk about side effects being these dangerous things. In programming, in publishing, when you are creating those books, they are what you are creating. It's not something that happens to be created through comments that were in your code. It's not something that just, well, we needed it, so we stuck it in. Documentation is typically a lot more about the what than the why. You've already bought this thing, so why would we need to tell you why you need it? Although those little flyers they include these days feel very wide. They just don't tell you much. And the other hassle here is that when you are actually selling a book rather than providing documentation, it makes a big difference in the willingness of customers to buy it. With documentation models, you can sometimes at least assume that 100% of the people who have the product have the documentation. If the documentation is free online, this is really pretty easy. But when you're selling a book, you start looking at more like 3 to 5% of people will buy it on a really, really good day. More typically, it's like 1%. So there are 2 reasons people buy these things. They need to work in a specific tech ecosystem, so they need to know how to make these things work. That's why I was buying Microsoft Access books. They've also, sometimes, heard that X is going to be the next cool thing, and they want to explore. One of my favorite things about the Rails publishing world was that the big gold rush in Rails publishing took place before Rails was commonly adopted. At the point when Rails was commonly adopted, people had stopped buying books, I guess because they already had a library from before. The Rails books sold to people who were exploring and who were trying to find something new and different. It's a mix. These things can happen different ways. And the best reason is when both of these are true. So not only is it the new and cool thing, but they're also using it. There's this really happy sort of early adopter moment which can drive sales beautifully. It's hard to get there. It's all about timing and getting things really just right. But when it works, it works. So this sounds like there are a lot of constraints on publishing, and there are. And sometimes those constraints aren't so good for the technologies that publishers are trying to cover. I can't get a book out on this new cool thing because I have these issues. Fortunately for that, tech has kind of taken things into its own hands. So technology is less and less dependent on people like me. I'm glad to be here on stage. I hope you all keep buying books. It makes the world better in many ways. But you don't need a publisher to publish anymore. You can, in a sense, publish by answering a question on Stack Overflow. You can publish by posting a video of yourself talking. You can self-publish a book. I really enjoyed the Erlang and Anger in particular, and I especially love its use of that Fallout shelter symbol. And the other one I have here is you can publish by giving a talk. Not every subject needs a book. There are a lot of subjects that fit beautifully in 1-hour talks. and half-hour talks that people will be really excited to come and hear, but they will not imagine in their wildest dreams buying a 200-page book on the same subject. So in the Erlang universe specifically, we have this room full of people. Hopefully you've all bought at least one book on Erlang sometime in your lifetime, but there are a lot more people out there, and we're trying to find ways to reach them. So we think of Erlang as looking something like this gorgeous city. It's lit up at night. Those towers are data structures, and there's communication networks between them. It reflects beautifully in the water. The clouds are just there for a little bit of extra excitement. Somehow this picture is named Cyber City Night. It just seems perfect. I don't know what city it actually is, except that it's clearly not Stockholm. Hong Kong? Okay, excellent. So we think of that. It's, this modern, beautiful, almost sculptural thing. People who are just arriving in Erlang, people who are picking up my introducing book, they think Erlang looks more like this. And to be fair, this is actually better than it looks to a lot of people, because I've been to those buildings and they're full of useful tools and people to explain how to use them. So we all know that Erlang is cool, no question. I've already said I'm addicted. I think it has stronger architecture than anything else out there. But telling the story of Erlang is awesome, and telling the story of why you personally need Erlang is very different. Some of that's hard to do in a publishing world where you're talking to a broad audience, because everybody has different needs. But there are some things that I keep finding happen over and over. So people who come into Erlang have heard about the cool, they want to see how this works, and none of the tools that they're used to work. Okay, they still have the command line, they still have the web, they still have some basic things. But if you spent the last 15 years in an IDE, it can be kind of a shock to find your way around Erlang. It's even more complicated because Erlang does so much so well itself that when you go to deploy Erlang, you're frequently not using the same setups that people are using for other kinds of projects. Now, as infrastructure has gotten a little more abstracted, as there are things like Docker, this is actually getting a little bit easier than it used to be. But it's still kind of a strange initiation for newcomers to Erlang. And there was a while, I would go to these talks, they'd be half an hour on how to build a blog in Rails in 5 minutes. The 5-minute demo followed by 25 minutes of what happened there, really? Was that really all just a security flaw that's letting you do that? Well, some days. These talks were everywhere. And I would go to them, and the rooms were packed. There was a Rails talk like this at an XML conference where I thought, we'll see this thing, it's not going to fly. And the room was packed. And as annoying as those demos were, as repetitive as they became, they reached an audience, showed them something simple, and brought them in. It worked. And we have a lot of people who have since built much more than blog software as a result. So thank you all for being here. It's great to have people at shows like this one. You're going to learn a lot. But there are a lot more people out there who could really use Erlang. I suspect that even if we just looked around Stockholm, we could double the size of this room, and there are many, many, many more out there. So what I'd like to see happen is, find more stories, talk about smaller steps. I love that we have React, that we have RabbitMQ, Chef, Heroku. All of these people are using Erlang. Those are not stories that I can walk up to somebody who's working on enterprise software and say, well, these guys are using it. Obviously, it'll fit your needs. Among other things, the response I've had a few times is, well, I like React, but I use it from Java. There's no problem. There's nothing in React that requires me to use Erlang, so can I just, let it stay in its own little box and not bother me? And that staying in its own little box is not that unusual. Technology adoption is not usually a flying leap. It can be a flying leap. If you're a startup, it makes sense for it to be a flying leap sometimes because you see something in technology that other people aren't using yet, and hooray, I can get there first and I can do this cool thing with it. However, for a lot of us who are using existing setups, who have to integrate with different networks, with different expectations, if you think about enterprise adoption in particular as probably the best model of this, you'll have experiments. Sometimes you'll have skunkworks experiments. Those are my favorites. But it's not just as simple as going up and saying, yes, we're using Microsoft.NET today, but we're doing this new thing over here, and I think that should all be Erlang. Or, you know, I just don't like our mail system. Can we just rip that whole thing out and replace it with this Elixir thing I'm writing? It just somehow doesn't go over very well. I don't know. So last year at Erlang Factory San Francisco, Dave Thomas and Josef Alim gave a fantastic talk about barriers to people coming into Erlang and the need to lower some of those barriers. And I was sitting there the whole time cheering because, you know, the books that I write, the nature of the work that I do is all about bringing in new people. And then I started listening to the folks around me. I started watching Twitter, and I realized that maybe I was in the wrong place. The simplest one was I use Erlang as a filter when I'm hiring for smart. Because if people haven't actually worked in Erlang, they're probably not very smart. I mean, no, not necessarily. But if people do work in Erlang, they've got to be super geniuses, right? Because who could get through all of these barriers? And if they got through those barriers, they're the ones for me. There were also some people who were like, well, Erlang solves all of these big problems. Why would you ever want to build something small in it? Why would we stop the machinery to make it easier to build things that were, you know, more approachable? And my favorite one, which is not just an Erlang thing, I've heard this a bunch of different times, is I don't want other people to know about this. I'm getting paid really well. If more people come in, there'll be competition. It'll be terrible. So, you know, we've built this cozy niche, or at least some people think we have. The problem is this is a perfect strategy for keeping the space small. We need to find a balance between we can do all of these cool things and be cool people and welcoming new people in to keep things alive, to keep things growing, to keep things moving. So a few experiments I've seen that have worked, I think. One of my favorite experiments is Etudes for Erlang, and there's also one for Elixir. This sort of happened by accident. I wrote Introducing Erlang, and my friend David Eisenberg is a community college professor. And the way that he learns things is by writing exercises for them and solving them. So he makes himself explain them to learn it. I kind of do the same thing with writing, but this is way more amazing. The exercises that he gave me were half again as large as the book. So that wasn't going to work, so we made it a separate thing. We made it available for free. Someone, I think Erlang Factory had something to do with this, realized that this was a good way to get training out in the world. And so different meetups started working their way through the Etudes and bringing people together. I went down to New York. I saw one of these live and in the flesh. They were doing some great things with GitHubs to share their code, and then in person talking about it, working through it. When we did Introducing Elixir, David also did an Etudes for Elixir. He's now working on an Etudes for ClojureScript. I'm hoping this model has legs. So the last thing I want to talk about in this space is other functional languages. At the beginning, when we looked at those sales figures, I kept talking about Haskell, Lisp. I even mentioned JavaScript. How should we work with these? How should we learn from these? Are we competing? Are we cooperating? Are we shooting at each other? Sometimes it really feels like we're shooting at each other. So I'll start with probably the easiest case. I'm sorry there's so much text on these slides. Hopefully these will be useful to people reading them afterwards. Elixir is probably the easiest case because it still is, in a lot of ways, Erlang. It's taking all the Erlang infrastructure. Newcomers to Elixir probably get that same shock that newcomers to Erlang have. But they've done a few things very differently. First, obviously, the syntax looks different. Some of the purposes of the language are different. I feel a little odd about being able to assign new values to an existing variable, but it seems to be working. But But the bigger thing that's different is Jose's approach from the beginning has been to include newcomers. It's one thing to say, we can answer your questions on our mailing list, go ahead and fire them and we'll answer them. It's another to really seek more detail on, okay, this bugs you, what can we do to make this better? How can we make this whole thing change? It was a weird privilege to be in the to be in the Elixir mailing lists at the beginning of the project when everything was really that wide open. But Jose has really kept this level of interest in the outside world at a fever pitch, and I've not seen anyone else do that. I was delighted when I opened that Elixir in Action package to see Sasha Jurek talking about how this is the nicest and friendliest developer community he's ever seen. I kind of marvel that Jose came from Rails, because that was not the case in Rails. He's clearly working on creating something very different, and I think it works. So even if you're not using Elixir, even if you have no interest in it, take some time to look at the community and how that can fit with what we're doing. Scala. Everything is Scala, right? 5 out of 6 bestsellers. Scala is a lesson, I think, about ubiquity. The Java virtual machine is everywhere. There are infinite libraries. There are infinite enterprises already using it. They made choices about the language that seem more familiar to Java people. I can look at Scala and even though it raises all of my Java questioning issues, I can read Scala fairly well because it connects to that Java background I had. I don't think I would enjoy Scala at all if I hadn't had a Java background, but it's not so hard. I have a question here about whether Scala adoption is changing Java. One of my colleagues was like, that's a dumb question. Of course it is. Lambdas are in Java because there's now this competition, so they have to have these things. And that's kind of an amazing feedback cycle to see. They're actually doing something different using somebody else's tools, and that somebody else, who in this case is Oracle, which seems even stranger, is learning from what these other people are doing and changing their language to reflect that. The last question I have here is Scala's momentum. I see Scala growing and growing and growing. I'm not sure whether it will hit some boundaries that I haven't figured out. The last one, and the one of these that seems most to get under the skin of Erlang people, is Go. Despite the cute gopher, I think that's the gopher. It's kind of like the gopher from Caddyshack, and we are Bill Murray trying to chase it. Go breaks all the rules that Erlang set. It has none of the virtues that Erlang set up as virtues. It doesn't worry about clean process separation. It's not all about messaging. It shares data, really. And at the same time, it makes a lot of the same promises that Erlang does. And a lot of the initial response I've seen from Erlang people was kind of the allergic reaction. That's not possible. That doesn't work that way. And in some ways, the Erlang folks are right, but at the same time, it's such a change from what people were used to doing in Python or in Ruby or in whatever, that Go may be a lesson about being better enough, and that it can offer just enough change to a world to make things possible that weren't possible without opening the whole horizon to everything magical that Erlang does. So I'm hoping that we can learn from all of these things. I'm not going to suggest that all of these languages are angels playing instruments, but we should listen to the different instruments and the harmonies that they're producing. There are people actually mixing all of these things up in a variety of environments. And I'm hoping that as we try to figure out how to make Erlang go, we can be listening not just to the people coming into Erlang, but to the people who've gone other directions. So I hope this keeps growing. This isn't quite as awesome a slide as Francesco's mashup of all of those covers. I didn't go for non-English books in particular. That's the Erlang side. This is the current Elixir side as I know it. I included Elixir SIPs there because I think we're going to see more and more video coming in and replacing a lot of what books have been doing. Sorry to throw that in as a end of talk throwaway, but and so to close, we know Erlang has superpowers. This is an amazing language. This is an amazing environment and ecosystem that lets you do things that just were hard before. But you have superpowers too. So go out, talk to people. If you want to write a book, that's possible. If you want to write articles, that's great. If you can be up on stage, all the better. Find ways to share the great stuff that you're doing, and you'll make life better for all of us. Thank you.